The United Nations Annual Climate Summit, COP27, is currently underway in Egypt. Climate finance has been the top focus. The United Nations has said that developing nations need up to $340 billion in funding per year by 2030 to combat adverse weather conditions. Rich nations so far have fallen short of promises and have financed only 10%. To take this discussion forward, we are now joined by Jyotsna Puri, who is the Associate Vice President of Strategy and Knowledge at International Fund for Agricultural Development, and she is joining us from the sidelines of the summit itself. Ms. Puri, good evening. Thanks a lot for joining us here on CNBC TV 18 and discussing whatever is actually happening at the COP summit this time around. And you are there. So I just wanted to start by asking you what the mood is like this time around. There has been a lot of talk and actually a lot of debate of converting these talks into actions. What feelers are you getting there?
Thank you so much, Sonal. I think the two key things that are coming through very clearly at this COP are one of credibility and the other one of justice. Clearly, we know that with the poly crisis, it becomes really important for us to look at the poorest, the most marginalized, and to really ensure that these are just transitions, even as we think about mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation is clearly the call of the hour, the clarion call that is being made by developing countries especially. And what we are seeing here is an increasing clamor for transferring those commitments that were made at Glasgow in Sharm el-Sheikh to essentially action and credible commitments at Sharm el-Sheikh. I think we're still falling very short, as you said as well. 340 billion is a very far cry. We're currently at $70 billion and globally. And I think what we do really require is for a lot of sources of finance to come and multiply that impact that we need to see on the ground, because it's really adapt or starve today.
Okay, adaptation finance, that remains the big focus. And of course, you've spoken about how short we are falling in this regard as well. You have quantified the number for us as well. $340 billion is what is needed. In that regard, you have been heading, or you've been spearheading big conversations here, big deals as well. What is International Fund for Agricultural Development doing here? Tell us more about the plans or the announcements that you've made at COP27, and how soon do you expect them to fructify?
Thanks very much, Sonal. So I think the key thing to recognize here is that we really need to recognize the people who are most constrained as well as most marginalized and left out in the climate debate. IFAD, or the International Fund for Agricultural Development, really focuses on small-scale farmers and small-scale producers. And these are people who are cultivating 2 hectares of land or less. They are the ones who get left out of a lot of the climate discussions. They contribute 1/3 of the overall food that we all eat globally. In the overall food that we see. So clearly, they're really critical to the overall resilience of the food system, but we also know that less than 2%, actually the number is 1.7% of the overall finance that is going to climate is going to small-scale producers. This is indefensible. The second number that I want to put out there is the fact that, yes, we are seeing a lot of private sector financing coming into climate, but most of it is going into mitigation. So the last number that I saw, and I can send you the source as well, is essentially saying that of the overall amount that the private sector is putting into climate, only 1.6%, which is a rounding off error really, only 1.6% is going into adaptation. The divergence between the financing that is going to mitigation, which is now commercially viable, and adaptation, which is not, which really requires concessional financing, which requires grant financing, is really indefensible. These are some of the things that we are doing within IFAD. We are getting the private sector onto our network, and we are working with them to essentially issue sustainable bonds. We are blending and we are assembling financing from different sources, including concessional finance, including our own program of loan and grants, and we are leveraging. So for every dollar that IFAD puts in, we leverage $8 for every dollar that we put in. It's really important that we get in the private sector. In this context, we've also brought in sustainable development bonds because we want to transfer that ambition that the private sector is putting out in terms of climate finance, and we want to transfer that to small-scale producers and farmers. And so we work very hard to develop these sustainable development bonds so that we can showcase that it is possible. And it is important to transfer that $328 trillion that are assets under management currently globally to help us cover both the adaptation gap as well as the gap in sustainable development financing.
Okay, so do you have any further plans? You did raise sustainable development bonds last year. You raised funds via that. Do you have any further plans? And when you talk about the gap in private sector financing when it comes to adaptation and mitigation, what is the sense or the feelers that you're getting at COP? Are more private companies or people from the private sector ready to contribute here?
Absolutely. And that's why I referred to the number, right? The $328 trillion that are assets under management is the number that is touted. So clearly there's financing available. But what is the absence? And there's need, definitely. We need $340 billion essentially for adaptation for developing countries. But clearly there's something that is missing. And this is the bankability of the project. What we are seeing is that in the NDCs and in the NAPAs, although they have been put together by developing countries, the ambition in there with respect to adaptation is not high enough. Secondly, they're not really budgeted or costed. So and this means that these do not then become bankable projects on the side. For bankability of projects, what we require is grant financing, and what we require is concessional financing, because it means that those investments or those plans have to be de-risked. And this is why the public and the private sector really need to work together in a symbiotic way so that we can de-risk it and then ensure that, yes, the private sector can come in to essentially take on the rest of both the junior debt, the senior debt, as well as ensure really that these investments are getting them both at least near market returns, but we are also able to ensure that there is a resilience as well as a mitigation credit that goes to them, which is why they're interested in the adaptation space, which is why they're interested in the mitigation space.
All right. Okay, Ms. Puri, valid points made there, and we'll keep discussing this with you in days to come. Thanks a lot for joining us today on this special broadcast and talking to us about all that's happening in COP27 and a lot more as well. And with that, it's a wrap on this special broadcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay tuned to CNBC TV 18. The news continues on the other side.